Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience in holding. We now have your presenters in conference. Please be aware that each of your lines is in a listen-only mode. You may submit your questions electronically at any time using the chat window located to the right of the slideshow. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's first presenter, Mr. Chris Hund.
Thanks, David. Hi, everybody. Happy Valentine's Day. Welcome to the monthly AHA team training webinar. Today's is on brain-based strategies to improve team leadership and healthcare and high reliability. Really excited to have you here today. Welcome, and we got a lot to cover, so we're going to get started. Just some rules of engagement. The audio for the webinar, you could hear that two ways. You could listen through your phone. If you do that, mute your computer speakers so you don't have any feedback. You could do that also, on the bottom right-hand corner of most computers. Also on this screen, you'll see a little speaker at the top. Just hit mute on that for mute my speakers. You could also listen through your computer. Normally, we tell people it might be better to listen through your phone because there's no lag. We'll do a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please write in questions as we go along so we could try to answer them as we go. If not, we'll hold them and do a Q&A session at the very end. So type in your answers as you think of them. We'll also send you an evaluation to your email after the webinar. Love for you to fill that out. A couple other things on this slide. In the lower left, there is a deck that says Files. That's where you could download this webinar both as a PowerPoint and as a PDF. We will also send this webinar out as a recording afterwards, so in case you miss anything or want to hear it again, you'll have that available to yourself. Also, there's some web links right next to where it says Files, so right in the center. And the web links is very important because they are live links and will match up to the web links you'll see as we kind of go through here. So you can click on them or click on the ones you see in the slide. They're all active. So like I said, I'm Chris Hund, Director of the AHA's Team Training Program. With Team Steps and the national implementation of Team Steps no longer supported for in-person events, the AHA has kind of taken that on. We've run the implementation of Team Steps for over half a decade, and so we are continuing to offer some of the same program components that you're used to, like the national conference and master training courses. We're also offering some different things. So one of the things you see here is consulting and coaching, and love for you to reach out to us if you'd like us to come out to your hospital and health system and work with you one-on-one. Some upcoming team training events. Next month's webinar, you can register right now. It is free, like all of our webinars are free. It's Transforming ED Teamwork to Achieve Great Results and Other Lessons Learned from Success. If you want to present on a webinar, we would love for that. We're always looking to have new partners and find new ways to be innovative. So you could submit your proposal today. Like I said, there's a link right there. And then 2018 Master Training courses are available. So these are the same regional training centers that have been, some of them doing this training for almost a decade. So we are still partnering with them, and if you want to send some folks to a master training course, please do so. Click on that link and find out more information about it, about the costs associated with it, etc. We also have our national conference. This is the 7th national conference that this team will be running. We'd love for you to be there. We think it's a great conference that's put together by the community for the community. It's very much driven by you and by the research you're doing and by the experiences and stories that you have. Take advantage of the early bird registration. Early bird registration is open until March 30th, so it's a little bit cheaper rate. We also have a justification letter to help convince your leadership, your boss, whomever, your spouse, that you should come out to sunny San Diego and spend a couple days with us. It's in SBAR format, so kind of cool because it keeps with the Team Steps theme. The program, we have 3 pre-conference workshops that you could sign up for. There's a master training course you could sign up for. Throughout the course of the program, there are 27 breakout sessions that you'd be able to go to on a variety of topics. There's networking and poster events and 3 keynote speakers. First is Jeff Skiles, who was a part of the Miracle on the Hudson, so a great event to talk about using teamwork skills. He was the co-pilot for Captain Sullenberger, so Skiles will be one of our presenters. Brian Sexton is our second day's presenter, or actually our first day's presenter, and his keynote is on the resiliency work that he's doing. It's a very interesting presentation. And then the third keynote speaker is a woman by the name of Vuk de Volpierre, and she has done a considerable amount of work on the concept of public narrative and community organizing. So work out of Harvard, work that has helped everything from the Civil Rights Campaign through recent presidential elections, how you go about telling your story, putting it all together, and getting it out to the field. So very useful when you're talking about how you go about and get people to want to implement and join your team. Contact information for us, as always, look at the website. AHA Team Training's website is aha.org/teamtraining, or you could email us or give us a phone call. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to toss things over to Dr. Oren Guttman, who has been somebody that's a great champion of team steps, has done a lot of great work and a lot of thinking about this. So he is from University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, where he is a high reliability officer, and also, I believe, does some teaching and all kinds of cool work. And so I think you're really going to enjoy listening to Oren today. So tossing it over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you and your team for all your help. Hello, everyone. Happy Valentine's Day to all of you. It's really a distinct pleasure and a privilege for me to be here with you and have this opportunity to just share some, I think, very practical thoughts and really a conversation on leadership and maybe thinking about that a little bit differently in the reference of how we can think about leading teams towards higher reliability. So thank you all. Sounds like we got a really cool audience over here from all over the country and all over the world, so I really appreciate this opportunity to spend some time with you today. So again, from UT Southwestern, hello, from the middle of Texas. I am an anesthesiologist in training. I still practice anesthesia, and that's kind of my 30% job. Most of my time nowadays I spend helping the health system reach higher levels of reliability. Got 2 objectives today. I'd like to sort of illustrate the effects of how some cognitive bias can affect leadership decision-making and its effect on teams. And then we hopefully can learn maybe a couple of techniques. I want to be practical today to leave you with something that you can actually go turn around and utilize with your teams to improve your resiliency of your team communication. So a long time ago, Patrick Lencioni actually wrote a really cool book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Some of you may be very familiar with this. And what I want to do today is take kind of a different approach to it. This is the framework of the book, where and it sort of works upwards. Teams that don't have trust simply can't work out conflicts. They have a fear of conflict. And when you have a fear of conflict, folks can't really be committed to your goals and objectives of whatever your team is being asked to do. When you've got a lack of commitment, there will always be avoidance of accountability. It's very difficult to set expectations when folks aren't ready to commit to things. You're dealing with a compliance as opposed to a commitment. And when there's an avoidance of accountability, ultimately, you're not going to reach your goals, you're not going to reach your benchmarks, you're not going to deliver your results, and you get an inattention to results. That's the framework of, in a nutshell, of the 5 dysfunctions of a team. My premise to you is that when we talk about these 5 dysfunctions, ultimately, it really comes down to the leadership of the team. And I'm taking for a moment and borrowing from a page out of this book called Extreme Ownership. This is a really interesting read, the military's view on teams and teamwork. One particular group in the military, you can see there, the SEALs. And I'm just going to highlight something for you. On any team and any organization, all responsibility for success and failure rests with the leader. The leader must own everything in his or her world. There's no one else to blame. The leader must acknowledge mistakes, admit failures, take ownership of them, and develop a plan to win. Leadership is the single greatest factor in any team's performance. That's a very profound statement. Whether a team succeeds or fails is all up to the leader. The leader's attitude sets the tone for the entire team. The leader drives performance or doesn't. And we know from the Team Steps literature that leadership really depends on situational leadership and the rest of the team speaking up and sharing perspective. How do those things jive? So what I'd like to propose to you today is a model to connect those things. When we think about leadership, everybody has cognitive errors. It's part of being human. And what I'm proposing to you today is that really it's the cognitive errors in leadership. It's specifically it's our sort of fast brain, that brain that works really intuitively and quickly, that can sometimes really affect the way we make leadership decisions and will ultimately lead to this 5 levels of dysfunction on a team. And I'm going to try and map that out for you today and give you a couple of specific tools in various domains to help you work through that. We're going to try and work with some metacognition. We're going to try and help you think about the way you're thinking, to sensitize you to the fact that you, like being a human, a fellow human, probably have some level of cognitive error. We all do. And then hopefully there's a couple of things we can do differently, intentionally, reflectively, deliberately, to help us modulate these things. You've probably heard of the STAR model at some point. We're sort of taking a page out of that book, so to speak. So that first level of lack of trust, right? How do we sort of build on that? And so this is kind of what it looks like when you don't have trust on a team, right? There's hesitance to ask for help. There's hesitance to offer or listen to constructive feedback. I think these things resonate with everyone when you've experienced this at some point in your life. You waste time managing, right? Most of the time other than innovating. And so what I'd like to point out is this really very keen observation by Patrick Lencioni. Remember, teamwork begins by building trust, and the only way to do that is to overcome our need for invulnerability. It's just a human need that we all have, but if we're going to build trust on a team, we have to move past that, right? We have to move past this denial that, that's a hole on your side of the boat, not on mine. And the reality is we have to affirm that we have mutual shared vulnerability. We are dependent on each other if we're truly a team. And if we're not, then we really are that group there that is bailing water out of a sinking ship on one side and the other saying, nah, that's not our problem. The reality, though, is that shared vulnerability, the greatest shared vulnerability that we have on a team is global awareness. It's simply the loss of critical information. And leaders are particularly sensitive to this. They're the ones that are held accountable, and they're the ones who have the greatest hyper-focusing. Without the situational leadership of the members of their team speaking up, sharing information, they will be tunnel vision by definition almost. And what I'm going to propose to you is that many times in leadership, the various cognitive errors that are at play, simply being human, can sometimes create this situation of a loss of situational awareness, a loss of global awareness, and how that plays out into these 5 functions, or dysfunctions rather. Leaders depend on folks to give discriminatory information. They really need folks to be able to speak up and share information with them so they can fully perceive reality as it really is. And so what happens is, often, leaders many times are overconfident. They're much too quick to accept intuition or act on incomplete information. They can sometimes even deny facts when they're presented with clear evidence to the contrary, discriminatory information, and they may lead to premature closure. These are classic effects of an overconfidence bias. It can lead to something even a little bit more sinister, which is called a confirmation bias, or search satisfying, stopping a search once you've sort of confirmed something that you had a preconceived notion in your mind about. And it's really the really high-performing teams don't do this, right? High-performing leaders actually inculcate and bring in and invite discriminatory information and process it. So here's a litmus test. What's a good indication that confirmation bias is affecting your leadership? Have you ever been in an unproductive meeting? Does anyone have that experience before? If you have, it might have looked something like this, right? Here's some signs of an ineffective meeting. It's the classic ones that we know about. No agenda, was an unclear purpose, seemed like there was a lot of talking but not a lot of doing or reaching of a goal. Didn't have the right people in the room. There's really no accountability for the deliverables, even if there were any created at the end, etc. But it's these at the end that I want you to sort of focus on for just a second. Have you ever been to a meeting where there's a lot of side conversation, almost texting between members in the meeting, whispering, meetings after meetings in the hallways, absent voices, restrictive participation, or even groupthink? If you've seen those, then you probably have a sign that there's confirmation bias at play. And you need to really question, particularly if you're in a position of leadership, is do you have all the information you need? Or are we in a situation where we're dealing with groupthink? So how do you actually improve your situational awareness so you're not in this situation of groupthink? So I'd like to present to you a concept out of the high reliability world, and it sort of helps you move past this inattention blindness, if you will. It's called adversarial review. And the reason it's called adversarial is in the sense that you're really inviting, as a leader, discriminatory information. You're really trying to get innovation and full ideation out on the table. And literature seems to show that many times this is not the case. Most of the time, there are differences in culture, differences in personality, differences in people's willingness for a variety of other reasons to share information. What I'd like to do is sort of present you with a couple ways that you can actually adopt an adversarial review with your team so that you can get better situational awareness on your team's mission and goals. You might see a mouse, you might see a cat, right? But you really need to know both of those things. And so this is really a process for generating the best optics on a situation. And the advantages of this form of review is that you're avoiding groupthink. You are really accessing discriminatory information that is important to your decision-making as a leader. It encourages innovation. It's more effective at capturing a variety of ideas. Many times people can only share ideas once at a time in a meeting when they're speaking. They can't all speak at once. And so there's many times, just simply because of time pressure, a limitation in the amount of ideas that can actually be generated. And some of the best ideas may not be generated at all. And so what I'd like to do is sort of help you think about a couple of techniques that might help you reach that objective. So remember one thing, though. The premise is that it is very difficult to speak up. It is psychologically risky behavior. And, you know, you're either going to call that an owl or you're going to call it a pig. But you as a leader have an obligation to welcome contradictory informations and alternative views. So here's how you do that. There's something called brainwriting. And this is a really cool technique. You get a group of people together, and what you do is you actually have a series of questions that you ask. You give them the same color pen, you give them an index card, and you ask them to write down their answers to a standard set of questions. You ask one question at a time. They write down their answer on the card. They flip the card and send it back to you as a facilitator. You mix that up and then send it back to the group. Now you're looking at someone else's response, but you have no idea who wrote that response. It's a colleague in the team who's at the table. You get a chance to react to that, build on it, expand on it, share discriminatory information about it. Whatever your perspective is, it allows for full ideation. You do this probably 2-3 times per question. This session can last about 30 minutes, and it's really powerful. It really allows a lot of ideas that normally wouldn't come out to actually enter the pool of meaning. Very valuable. There's a different form of adversarial review referred to as TRIZ. It comes from the Liberating Structures book. TRIZ is a process of really encouraging heretical thinking. It's sort of coming to answer the difficult question of what must we stop doing to make progress on our deepest purpose. That's a tough question for a lot of people because it really, people's emotions are tied to things that they've done and created, and sometimes that's no longer aligned or is not what's needed. And that's difficult. And so TRIZ is a process that allows you to actually ask that question in a meaningful way. And so again, it sort of builds on this process of doing things alone, doing things in groups of 2 and then 4, and then reporting out to the room. And it asks some very powerful questions. Identify all you can do to achieve the worst result imaginable with respect to your objective. And then it asks all the counterproductive activities or programs or procedures Is there anything that we're currently doing that is in any way, shape, or form resembling those things? And then what would you say the first steps that you would do to stop those things in list 2? Those are very challenging questions, very honest questions. You get together in groups of 2 and you share lists, you compare lists, you build on those ideas, you reflect on them together. You then take 2 and 2 and make a team of 4 and do the same. And then finally, those groups of 4 report out to the room. And what emerges is a very interesting sort of backdrop of what the group thinks are things that probably need to go away. Difficult things, difficult questions, but very powerful questions. The last form of adversarial review that I'm going to present you today is called Wise Crowds. Again, this from the Liberating Structures book, and there's a website that you can look at as well, has a variety of these various forms of innovation, techniques for innovation. This is a very good one, where the leader is the client, and they're asking for advice or help with a challenge. They're asking their team to be the consultants. Except here's the interesting piece of this. The leader actually doesn't look at his team. They're literally back to back. And that's so that their facial expressions as the team is giving the consultant doesn't bias the team towards one direction or another. You're offering advice, you're sharing perspective as a team, and giving your team leader information that's critical to the success of the team. And again, this is a really interesting process because it sort of moves away from that groupthink phenomenon that can sometimes occur. The last thing I'm going to show you here is the what and why rounds. It's important to spend time asking questions about what you want to start and stop doing, what should be done differently. There was a really interesting article in the Harvard Business Review a few years back based on this idea of SKS. It's just a series of 3 very powerful feedback questions that this comes from. And these are really, really telling questions, and they can actually really help your situational awareness as a team leader. So moving on, we've kind of talked about some of the practical things you can do to raise your situational awareness as a team leader. Moving on to this area called the fear of conflict. How do we work through that? What I want to focus on here is particularly a few different biases that lead to fear of conflict. One in particular is this idea of an outcome bias, which is, well, all is well that ends well. If it ended well, who cares about the process? At the end of the day, everything went okay. And that's actually a pretty big error because you really don't know what led to that thing going well, and you don't really know what you can do to improve. And so the idea here would be to debrief with your team. That sounds pretty tongue-in-cheek, but what I'm going to focus on here is adding one other piece of this. Have you ever heard of the 5 Why technique? The 5 Why technique comes out of the Lean Six Sigma literature, and what I'm suggesting is that you sort of marry this 5 whys on what went well. Ask why it went well 5 times, and do the same for the opportunities that you can actually improve on. That gives you a much deeper and broader understanding of process, not just outcome. I think leaders end up being biased many times on what's the bottom line, what's the end result. But it's incredibly important to understand the process in which those results were obtained, because when you don't understand the process, it's very difficult to improve. 5 Whys is a really powerful technique to do that. This next layer that we're going to talk about is this idea of once there's a fear of conflict, then it's very difficult for folks to commit. And so the first reason why there's a lack of commitment is usually because there's no buy-in. And so what I'd like to point out here is why that is the case. Why don't folks on your team buy in, and how is that playing in? So we're going to play a quick game together, and it's going to be difficult to poll you, but in the chat box you can kind of type in if you're gonna either play the game or you're gonna pay $100 to not play the game. So those are the 2 options. You either play the game or pay $100 and you're not gonna play the game. So here's the deal. This gentleman has a normal coin. It's not a rigged coin. Wow, we got a lot of people wanting to play the game already. Awesome. If he throws a heads, you're gonna win $10,000 in cash. But if he throws a tails, you're going to have to go ask family and friends and pay him $2,000 in cash. That's the game, right? Straight up, no tricks, no rigged coin. My question to you is, are you going to play the game, or are you going to pay $100 and say, no, thank you, I'd rather not play the game? So it's interesting. I'm looking at the chat box. I think you can all see there's a lot of people that want to play. There's a couple that would rather pay and leave. And usually when I've asked this question, probably to the tune of near 1,000, maybe 1,500 people now, it's about 2/3 don't want to play the game, usually. A lot of you here actually do want to play the game. And you can keep those answers coming. Let me show you the result of this. If you were purely logical, right, and you didn't have a cognitive bias called loss aversion, then here's how you should have made this decision. There's something called the expected value, and it's just simply what you can expect the benefit to be, and it's the probability times the payoff. It's very straight math, nothing confusing there. So if you wanted to play the game, there's a 50% chance they threw heads. If he threw heads, you would have won $10,000. So your expected value is $5,000, but he could have thrown a tails. That's also a 50% chance. And in that case, you would have had to go and get $2,000. And so that would have been a negative $1,000 on the tail throw. The overall expected value, positive 4,000. So if you're purely logical, which most of us are not, we're human, you absolutely should play the game. You should play the game all day, as many times as you can play the game. So for those of you who wanted to play the game, I think you made the right choice. Logically, you should. If you didn't want to play the game, then remember, that's a probability of 1. You're not playing the game. I'm giving you $100. There should be a negative sign in front of that. Forgive me. And then your expected value is negative 100. So simply by logic, you should absolutely play this game. But what happens is, and most people that I've asked this question to, they don't want to play the game. And the reason is because of this adage, a bird in the hand is better than 2 in the bush. There's something called loss aversion. It's part of the human experience. We feel pain from loss literally twice as bad as we feel a gain or pleasure from a win. It hurts more to lose than it feels good to win. It's just the nature of being human. Why that is, I've got a theory about it, right? We've got probably 4 basic emotions. Some people think 5. 3 of them are negative emotions, fear, sadness, and anger. And when you think about that, we do a lot in our lives to avoid those emotions. We work really hard to not experience loss. It's just part of being human. And that plays into how we make decisions as leaders and how as members of a team we actually engage in a process. It literally hurts almost 2 times more to lose than it feels good to win. Uncertainty is perceived as loss. You guys remember Steve Jobs. He actually had a curable form of pancreatic cancer. I think a lot of you know that. He did not want to have surgery. And he simply, the reason why, he had a preference. He perceived opening his body as a certain sense of loss. He had loss aversion. And he didn't want to do that. And that was his preference. And this is, honestly, there's a bell curve about this. People are either risk-seeking or risk-averse, but there's a lot, I think that the majority of people have some level of loss aversion. They're just uncomfortable and perceive uncertainty as loss. Leaders, there's a lot of leaders out there who are very affected by this. When you think about leadership styles, there is a whole spectrum of leadership that are simply trying to avoid loss. They're uncertain, and uncertainty is perceived as loss. And so when you think about it, and when you think about motivators and demotivators, one of the most, I think, impactful things that I can share with you today is that while we hope that people function on the top of the Maslow triangle, when we have teams, we have to make sure that we have removed the demotivators so that we can move past compliance and actually get into commitment. It's demotivators that are almost twice as powerful because of loss aversion than motivators are. And this insight, I think, is something that you can take on when you roll out process improvements, recognizing that when you talk about adaptive challenges, that's a 2-to-1 opportunity. Recognize that when you, as a leader, aren't moving demotivators, you're going to get very little commitment. And so you, as a leader, have to expel myths. It's your job to do that, right, about loss and about the hallway talk. It's your job as a leader to recognize loss aversion and its impact on engagement. How do you do that? With the power of framing. I'm going to show you an experiment here that I think really very nicely illustrates how unbelievably powerful this idea is. This is an old study in the New England Journal of Medicine. They asked 167 subjects. Imagine you had lung cancer, and they told half of the 100 people having surgery, 10 are going to die in surgery. 32 are going to die at 1 year, 66 die at 5 years. Of the 100 having radiation therapy, nobody dies the first year in treatment. No one dies in treatment. 23 die by 1 year, and 78 die by 5 years. And they said, what do you want, radiation or surgery? It's pretty much a toss-up. Watch what happens. They flipped it, right? Instead of saying die, they said survive. Do you see that? So instead of 10 die, 90 survive. And same thing. Instead of 66 die, 34 survive. And they asked a group of physicians, and they said the following. Of the 100 people having surgery, 90 are going to survive surgery, 68 are going to survive at 1 year, 38 survive 5 years. Everybody having radiation, all survive. 23 will survive at 1 year, and then 22 will survive at 5 years. And they said, what do you want? Well, this time, a whole lot more people wanted surgery. 34% change. Now, you obviously realize nothing there changed except the way they presented the information, the way they framed it. That's the only piece of this that actually changed. It's incredibly powerful how you frame things as a leader and how it's perceived as either a motivator or a removal of a demotivator, right, like dying. And so the message here is that part of how we as leaders message and talk will have incredible impact. How we frame will have incredible impact on how our words are received. You have to be ready to answer as a leader, in any process improvement, any new way, what's in it for me as the employee? What tangible benefit or win are they going to get from engaging in the new process? You have to be able to anticipate their concerns, and particularly their demotivators, and speak them out with solution before, almost ahead of them, if you will. Second challenge that you have with a lack of commitment, that third error in the 5 errors of a team, is the reason that you have that is a role ambiguity. So I'm going to show you something here that I think can be really helpful. Many times you'll see that your team is almost regressing. I want you to think of it by working backwards. If you're regressing, you probably have the wrong people doing the wrong task. But if you're sensing frustration, it could be that you are on task, but you got the wrong people for that task. What I found is that when you have confusion, it could be that you do have the right people, but they're not on the right task. It's when you have the right people aligned with the right task is actually when you make progress. And this issue of role ambiguity is a big deal. It's really important, and this is on leaders, to set very clear expectations. Your team has to know how to win. If they don't know how to win because you haven't told them what the expectations are, it's very difficult to hold them accountable. And it makes their lives all the more difficult to function and follow. Avoiding giving feedback after expectations are being set is another reason why folks end up having ambiguity. So pay attention to how you're voicing things and how you're clarifying things, how you're actually expressing things. All of these things come into how you frame things. And the issue is that, remember, there is a bias that no news is assumed as good news, right? Well, that's a problem because you can't hold your team accountable without clear expectations for them up front. And so the reason that you're probably not doing this is if you're getting the outcome you want, but the process is on fire, you're falling susceptible to that outcome bias. How do you get past that? Well, again, it's doing structured feedback, right? The things that you're supposed to do. So this model, again, works off this SKS model. It's start doing more of this, start doing this, do more of this, change how you do this, do less of that, and stop doing this. Right? And these are very basic rules around feedback. These are things you do and don't. But actually having a structure for this, where you do it regularly, scheduled on the calendar, where you're giving feedback, is a critical thing that team members need from team leaders. And when team leaders don't do this, it's usually because of a cognitive error. The last thing I'm going to mention about this piece is the idea of group feedback. So a lot of you have millennials in the workforce. A lot of you work with millennials. And millennials are a different workforce. They're very innovative. They're very collaborative. And what you might find is that the old view of 360s, there has valuable information, but it also creates a lack of trust. I would encourage that the model from Fierce Conversations a whole lot better. Fierce Conversations does not like the idea of 360s, because what ends up happening is, especially with the millennial workforce, is there's a lot of unnecessary effort trying to figure out who said that, why'd they say that, as opposed to hearing the message. Fierce encourages direct, honest conversation. If you think about it, the conversations that need to be had are around relationship building. And if you don't know who said that thing, you're left trying to figure that out. It's very hard to mend a relationship or advance a relationship. Fierce encourages that folks have honest dialogue between each other and work things out directly to build relationship. Finally, the idea of a lack of accountability. So I love this picture. Everybody's working hard, but when it finally comes to mission, they're off the mark. Well, it's probably because they didn't speak when they were way back behind that wall. They should have been in communication with each other, and they simply weren't. There wasn't mutual accountability. These folks worked independently of each other. And so when that happens, there can be many times either omission or commission errors. Many times you'll have duplication of effort or inefficient task completion, and sometimes even you can have substitution error. And so the way around that is this idea of mutual accountability. I want to suggest something practical around this. So we are all familiar with closed-loop communication. We use it in our clinical worlds. What I'd like to suggest to you is that you utilize and embed this in your team structure and process. I don't own any stock in Wunderlist. I just wanted to tell you that now. This is one app of probably many that are out there. I use this app with my team, and I think it's incredibly powerful. What I like about it is the idea that there's closed-loop task closure and there's full transparency. You can know what everyone's tasks are, when they're due, the progress made on them. And when you've closed that task or you have subtasks related to it, what happens is that there's a mutual sense of creation, collaboration. You can add to this, but there's also an accountability piece because everyone knows that that's on your list and it's imminently available to anyone. It's a really great way of closed-looping tasks. When any one of those tasks is done, you can turn it off if you don't want that information, but it lets everyone know that you completed that task. It's advancing transparency, I think, to a different level, and it's very effective. Finally, the last error that is in this 5-error model is this idea of inattention to results. And so I'm going to ask the question. It comes from a book called 4DX, The 4 Disciplines of Execution. How do you know what the score is? In other words, every team has a score. Every team has a goal. Every team is meant to deliver on certain outcomes. Does your team know what winning even looks like? Does your team know that they're actually winning or losing? What's the score? Where's the score kept? How do they know that they're advancing towards the score or not? And so everything is in line or out of line? You can't win a game if you don't know the score. And I think a very powerful lesson from this is, practically speaking, you should have and leverage some way of actually recognizing. Sometimes it's through competition, but sometimes it's just attention through visual management to process, right, not just outcome. And then at other times, it's actually outcome, peer-to-peer influence. And so it's something to think about, right? Is there a way for your team to recognize each other, that they're actually meeting goals, that they're actually advancing the objectives of the team? Do you know the score? Do they know what winning means? Do they know about process, not just about outcome? Are they actually able to comment and support each other during process? And so with that, one of the things that is particularly useful is this idea of leadership influence rounding. This isn't the classic sort of executive rounding. This is a very scripted process. Dr. Reinertsen actually advanced this idea a long time ago, and there's a reference at the bottom if you're interested in learning more about this. But this is a very, very, very specific way of advancing and helping frontline staff engage with leadership to understand the score and actually how the work on the front end is actually affecting the score. Something to consider. Whoops. I don't know what just happened, but let me see if I can get back over here. Something just died. So you can probably hear me, but I cannot see you. So I am coming back to the session. Give me 1 second, little technical error there. My Adobe Connect died just in time. And it'll be an opportunity to take questions now. I think we've got a couple minutes here.
Sure, Oren, not a problem.
Thank you. Trying to connect. I don't know, it just kind of died on me. But just on time, I guess.
Well, do you want me to advance the slide, or do you want me to ask questions?
We could probably take questions at this point.
All right. Sounds good. So
Trying to log back in here. Thank you.
Okay, not a problem. Well, let's focus on some questions about things you've recently talked about. So when you were talking about getting away from, you know, and this even goes back to when you were talking about the TRIZ, but the idea of getting away from the "we've always done it that way" mentality. How do you overcome that, especially if you're a new leader, whether you're new to the organization or you're young, you're getting in? Like, how do you get some of these ideas moving forward with folks that probably don't want to think about new ways of leadership, and definitely don't want to think of new ways of leadership that maybe put some threat to the way that business has always been done?
That's an awesome question. So, I mean, I think you hit on a really big tension, right? There's a tension and a drive for conformity and social conformity, because that builds trust. You don't want to be the one who's looked at as the outsider to a group particularly when you're first joining it. So, that's a drive, and that is certainly a need that people have, is to fit in and feel a part. On the second hand, you see opportunity for improvement. And those things, many, many times, don't necessarily align. I think the answer is timing. I think the answer is creating early wins with those people with whom you establish credibility, so that at the right time you can bring about, when it's appropriate and in context, a potential change. You're not going to boil the ocean. And I think that's oftentimes the error, is that folks maybe want to do too much too fast. There is a pace to this. Culture is a breathing entity. It's not something that can be evolved in months or even a year or two. It takes a much longer time. At least that's what the literature seems to say.
So along the same lines, Umberto, who asked this question, please chat in if I'm getting it wrong. But what do you do if you're kind of managing individuals that are maybe across many organizations, or perhaps you don't really have the technical authority over? So the example that was chatted in, was about if you were managing a society's board, right? So a lot of people that really are not, you're not their manager, you're not their leader, you might be the situational leader, but still you don't have that authority to really make these changes. How do you bring this to that kind of situation?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I really appreciate it. It's something that I've thought a lot about, and this is the model that I use, right? You use the word authority, and what I've come to realize. Turn that off. All right, I think you can hear me now. Is that what you really need to do is work down a different path, which is influence, not power, not authority. So positional influence or authority creates an imposed consequence, right? And that ultimately may lead to compliance for a specific amount of time. But that's really transactional. That's not transformational. What you need is personal influence. What's needed is not education, it's persuasion. And that's only done by relationship building and personal influence, which leads to natural consequences and commitment as opposed to compliance. When you've gone from personal influence to natural consequence and commitment, that's where you see transformation. So it's sort of, you really have to be able to be persuasive. It's not so much thou shalt. That's not going to work.
Got it. Yeah, Yeah, authority is probably not the right term there, but yeah, I see what you're saying entirely. Stepping back a little bit towards the beginning, somebody had asked, how does codependency jive with the strong leader statement?
How does codependency jive with, might you rephrase the question so I can get my head around it a little bit?
I'm going to ask that person to re-chat it in because that's all I've got. So I'm going to move on.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm trying to get my head around it, guys.
Not a problem. Can you give some examples of the wise crowds model? I love the liberating structures. They're available for, the website has them all up as free
really
source
cool stuff,
things, which is really cool. But yeah, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, wise crowds I think is, so it's really interesting. So I actually got a chance to do this recently at an ICE conference here in Texas. And it was very powerful. So you get to ask a question. Imagine that you're back-to-back, not literally back-to-back, but you're seated in a way where you're close proximity, folks hear you, you hear them, and you ask them a problem that you're having. You describe the context of the problem. You describe why it's challenging to you, and not any solutions that you've tried, because you don't want to anchor them. You want them to be innovative. And they basically encourage them to spend some time together as the consulting group to discuss among themselves some potential solutions to the challenge, some other questions they want to ask. And then they begin the process of investigation with you, and they ask you, and they discuss with you. And then they, at some point, come to some, I guess, recommendations, the way a consultant would. You may want to try X, you may want to try, Y, many times based on their experiences. One of the points of wise crowds, which I sort of glossed over, but is in the notes there, is it's really powerful when you get a diverse group of people with different skill sets, right? So this shouldn't, you don't have to limit this to people that you typically work with. You may actually do better by sort of pulling in people who you may not work with all the time, but have very different ways of thinking and very different skill sets that might enable you to think very differently about the problem. And that might be, to quote the website, liberating.
Yeah, that's a great one. I've done that one before, and it really does help people. You see a lot of the light bulbs go on as they're listening to their or not their coworkers, but as they're listening to others talk about their issue. Like you said, it's better for it to be people with different backgrounds or from different organizations if you have that ability. Mm-hmm. So I think going back to the question I just attempted to ask, so early slides really focused on the importance of leaders or the leader, and then you moved on to the importance of codependency. So can you talk a little bit about how those two things work together?
Yeah, thank you. I think I understand now the question. So the key message here is that the greatest shared vulnerability of the team and the team leader is global awareness, situational awareness. It's up to the team leader, ultimately it's their responsibility, but they depend on the rest of the team to give them a full picture of reality. No one leader can possibly ever have full global awareness without their team members offering situational leadership. And that relationship is a codependency because they're in the same boat. You need a leader to be a leader, and you need a team to be a follower. And if you sort of depend on each other for various pieces of the team dynamic, for that situational awareness in particular to develop. And so it's sort of like a catch-ball, if you will. While the leader might have to help influence direction on the team, which direction should be taken depends on the team, depends on the information that the team is offering the team leader. And that many times ends up being the limiting variable. Now, why that was the subject of what we talked about. How is it that team leaders can end up potentially not obtaining optimized situational awareness? Well, it's probably because of lack of trust, lack of commitment, all of these various cognitive errors that play into why those end states result.
Got it. Excellent. So this individual here was asking, as a patient and family advocate and advisor who is sitting on some advisory boards and councils with physicians and leaders, they feel that they're not really a member yet of the day-to-day team, right? But they're there and they're really representing others by sitting on these boards. So how can this person who feels like they are kind of on the outside but still sitting on the team kind of push the people on those advisory boards to broaden their perspectives and to think more of the patient and the family and the caregivers as they're doing things and as they're redesigning things? What kind of strategies do you think they could have? I think this goes back to what you were talking about, you know, having that soft power almost, but...
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, and I'm thinking about it. I'll share with you what my chairman once shared with me. It's a brilliant insight that I think is very powerful. He said to me once that, you know, someone will walk a mile for you if they know you want something for them. And I think that when you're on a board or a team like that, and you're a pseudo member of the team, you would do well, aside from building personal relationship with that person, to then understand what their needs are, but deeply understand it. Make it your priority to understand it. And if you're able to help that person, that would be an entry into that space.
Thanks. That's great. That's great, Oren. All right. So, a couple other things. You know, somebody was asking, how do you go about finding a mentor to, you know, help you kind of gain some of these tools that you're using to help you succeed? I think that's a good question, but I kind of would want to know about your story, Oren. How did you have somebody mentor you? How did you come across some of these insights and kind of know where to research and where to look?
You know, that's a really fair and honest question. I've been really blessed to have awesome mentorship and sponsorship here at UT Southwestern. We are an academic medical center, and, you know, I'm a member of the faculty here of the Department of Anesthesiology and Pain Management, and part of that is faculty development. And, you know, it just turned out that my pathway ended up kind of moving in the direction of understanding how teams and teaming work in healthcare systems. And that played out in simulation, it played out in leadership, it played out in high reliability and culture. And the people that had sort of helped me along and helped me understand this space just sort of naturally guided me in this pathway. It's sort of, I guess I'm a product of the environment, if you will. I don't know if I would have ended up in this way if I had been in some other place, but it's just kind of where it led me. I don't know if that's a good answer, but it's an honest one.
No, thank you. Thank you. I think, you know, we got some more questions, and people have sent us all kinds of things. I'm going to ask for you to do maybe one more, just talking a little bit more, if you can, about how do you help, how do you think these strategies could help frontline managers when they're trying to get their staff to embrace, let's say, doing some team steps tools? How would you use these strategies to help those folks understand that, you know, doing these tools are not a part of an initiative, but instead are really just the way you do business? It's the standard day-to-day work.
Yeah, so that's a really practical question.
Yeah.
I would say, you know, if you used adversarial review to kind of understand what the staff think, what and why rounds, right? If you really understood what do we need to do, what do we need to stop doing, what do we need to start doing, and you got what was, to use the sort of cliche Covey term, what's urgent and important in their eyes, then you could figure that out and understand which piece of team steps to start building around, right? You don't have to do the entire rollout initially. It might end up being something where you could say, you know what, Team Steps has a tool for that. That sounds like we need to talk about speak-up behavior. Let's do a CUS module. Or, you know what you're saying is that handoffs are terrible. We need to focus on SBAR, IPASS, whatever the case might be. So tailor the tool to what they think is important, and how do you figure out what's important to them? So that's where you invite them to be the real, to give you real honest feedback, as opposed to just getting them in a room and saying what's important, because we established that kind of ideation is incredibly limiting. There's a lot of voices that are not going to come out. Try something different to really get them to share with you what they think.
Thank you, Oren. You've got your email address up here on the screen, and I know that you said that you'd be happy to answer people's questions if we didn't get to some of them.
I'm absolutely happy to answer them. Please email me, and I can't promise you I'll turn it around in a day. I get a lot of email, but I'm more than happy to be a facilitator. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, all of you who made the time to listen to me. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I look forward to reading the chat box afterwards and learning from all of you. Thank you so much.
For sure, Oren, thank you. Super appreciate. Think people really enjoyed this. A lot of great conversation on the side. Thank you all for listening. We've got another webinar next month on March 14th, I believe. But please stay in touch. Email us with questions you might have. Visit our website. Like I said, we're happy to be able to point you in the right direction, to the right expert, to help you with some on-site consulting, to get you to the right master trainer course, to get you to our national conference. We're excited to be continuing this journey with you. We've been on for about 7 years, so we look forward to many more wonderful conversations with you all to come. So that concludes the webinar. Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's presentation. You may disconnect your phone lines, log off the webinars, and thank you for joining us.